Lena Brooks had been a maid at Blackwood Estate for almost 2 years. She knew exactly how each member of the family liked their morning coffee. She knew which crystal glasses belonged in which dining room cabinet, which elderly guests slipped extra bills to the kitchen staff, and which wealthy visitors never once looked a servant in the eye. She was the quietest employee in the mansion. That was exactly how she wanted it. At precisely 7:42 p.m., during Blackwood Estate's annual charity gala, a convoy of black security vehicles rolled through the front gate. Everyone assumed the new arrivals were part of the estate's private detail. Lena noticed something nobody else did. One guard adjusted his earpiece with his left hand while gripping his rifle with his right. Professional security never carried a weapon that way. Too loose, too eager, the stance of someone who trained in a basement instead of a unit. She read the rest of the room in under 4 seconds. Wrong formation at the doors. Wrong eyes. Scanning exits, not threats. Wrong silence, the kind that came before noise, not after it. Not bodyguards. Hunters. Gunfire shattered the ballroom windows half a second later. Crystal rained from the chandeliers. Guests screamed and dropped to the marble floor. Champagne glasses shattering beside them. A man stormed in through the smoke and broken glass, flanked by 4 others in matching tactical vests, moving with the practiced calm of someone who had done this before and gotten away with it every time. His eyes swept the room, cataloging targets the way Lena had just catalogued threats. He needed leverage, something soft, something that would make the room behave. His gaze landed on her, a maid, pregnant, alone near the service entrance. Apron still dusted with flour from the kitchen. She'd been called away from 20 minutes earlier. He crossed the room in 6 strides and wrapped an arm around her throat, dragging her back against him, the barrel of his pistol pressed cold against her cheekbone. "Nobody moves," he shouted to the room, "or she's the first one who finds out what happens." The ballroom went rigid with terror. Mothers covered their children's eyes. A waiter dropped a tray of champagne flutes that shattered unheard beneath the screaming. Everyone in that room expected the maid to sob, to beg, to go limp with fear the way hostages were supposed to. Lena did none of it. She lifted one hand, slow and deliberate, and laid it flat against the curve of her stomach. Then she looked at him, not at the gun, at him. The steady, assessing look of someone reading a man's pulse rate through his grip, the tremor in his trigger finger, the way his weight shifted onto his back foot when he was nervous, the look of someone measuring a threat, not surviving one. The man, Victor Kane, though no one in that ballroom knew his name yet, felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a word for. "You scared?" he asked, leaning closer, expecting the question to break her. Lena held his eyes for a long moment, long enough that 2 of his own men exchanged an uneasy glance behind him. Then, quietly enough that the words seemed to land harder than if she'd screamed them, she said, "You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." The ballroom went silent in a different way now. Not the silence of fear. The silence of a room sensing it had just witnessed something it didn't understand. Victor's grip on her tightened instinctively. A reflex, not a decision. He searched her face for the panic he was used to seeing in moments like this. He found none, only a terrible, unhurried calm. The kind that didn't belong to a maid, didn't belong to anyone who hadn't already survived something far worse than a gun to the head. For 1/2 of 1 second, Victor Kane, a man who had walked into 17 rooms just like this one and never once felt his pulse change, felt something he would later be unable to name. He had taken the wrong hostage. He simply didn't know it yet. Behind him, his men began herding the rest of the guests into the center of the ballroom, barking orders, zip-tying wrists, collecting phones into a black duffel bag. The gala, that had been planned for 3 weeks, flowers flown in from Amsterdam, a 12-piece orchestra, place settings worth more than most people's cars, had become something else entirely in the span of 90 seconds. Lena's eyes moved past Victor, sweeping the room the way she'd swept it 100 times while serving canapes and refilling wine glasses. 5 exits. 2 of them already blocked. A waiter, pale and frozen by the kitchen doors, close enough to be useful, calm enough not to do anything stupid. An elderly woman near the string quartet, hand pressed to her chest, breathing too fast. Lena catalogued all of it without moving her head, without giving Victor a single reason to suspect the maid in his grip was doing anything but trembling. Beneath her apron against her skin, the wedding ring she never wore in public sat locked in a small wooden box 3 floors above them, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the servants' quarters. The only proof in the world that the woman currently held at gunpoint was not in fact a maid at all. She was Lena Romano, and somewhere across the city, in a house with no name on the gate, a phone was about to ring. Comment loyalty below if you believe the quietest person in the room is usually the most dangerous one, and subscribe, because a pregnant maid just got taken hostage, and the man holding her has no idea who he's really up against. The phone never rang. Not yet. For now, there was only the ballroom, the broken glass, and 43 hostages learning how to be afraid in real time. A child sobbed somewhere near the string quartet's abandoned chairs. His small hands pressed over his ears as if that could undo the gunfire. His mother tried to shush him, her own voice cracking too badly to comfort anyone. Near the bar, a woman in an emerald gown had gone rigid, eyes fixed on nothing, breath coming in short, useless gasps. The waitstaff, kneeling where they'd been ordered, stared at the floor like looking up might get them shot. Lena did none of that. Still held against Victor's chest, his arm a steel bar across her collarbone, she let her eyes move, slow, unhurried, disguised as the dazed stare of a frightened woman. In reality, she was counting. 5 men, not 4. 1 more. Posted at the east hallway she hadn't clocked before. 3 exits sealed, 2 still open, both guarded by the youngest of Victor's crew, the one whose hands hadn't stopped moving since he walked in. She catalogued the weapons next. Standard rifles on the 2 by the door. The man near the bar carried something else. Compact, matte black, a precision sidearm that didn't belong in a smash-and-grab ransom job. European. Expensive. The kind of weapon people bought when they expected to actually need it. That detail snagged in her mind and refused to let go. She studied the men's faces. The one Victor called Reyes flinched every time a guest moved too fast, fear dressed up as aggression. Another, older, stood with the stillness of someone who'd done this before and grown bored of it. That one was dangerous. The young one by the door was the opposite. Twitchy, sweating, a finger resting too close to the trigger guard. Untrained, unpredictable, the most likely to fire by accident. Leadership ran through Victor, clearly, but it wasn't absolute. The older man glanced at him for confirmation before every order. A second voice in the room, even if Victor didn't fully realize it yet. "You're doing it again," Victor said. Lena blinked, the dazed expression sliding back into place a half-second too late. "Doing what?" "That." He turned her slightly, studying her face like a puzzle missing a piece. "You're not looking at the floor. You're not crying. You're not begging me to let you go." He tilted his head. "Who are you?" "A maid," Lena said quietly. "Try again." "A maid," she repeated, and this time let her voice tremble, just enough, just believable enough to make him doubt himself instead of her. It didn't work as well as it should have. She could see that in his eyes. Nobody in that ballroom believed her anymore. Not the guests stealing glances at her like she was something they couldn't classify. Not Victor's men who'd started watching her instead of watching their hostages. And not Victor himself, whose grip had loosened, not from mercy, but from confusion. The unconscious hesitation of a man no longer certain what he was holding. The crying child's sobs grew louder, hiccuping into panic. His mother had nothing left to offer him. "Let me go to him," Lena said. Victor's jaw tightened. "Funny way to ask, considering I'm the one with the gun." "You won't shoot a 6-year-old's mother for letting her comfort him. That's not the kind of man you are." She said it simply, like a fact rather than a guess, and something in Victor's face shifted. Surprise, maybe, that she'd bothered to consider what kind of man he was at all. He let her go 3 steps, not more. Lena knelt in front of the boy, ignoring the gun trained on her back, and spoke low and steady, until his sobs softened into shaky breathing. She did the same a moment later for the elderly woman in emerald, pressing 2 fingers gently to her wrist, counting silently, murmuring something about slow breaths until the woman's color returned. When an injured waiter, grazed by flying glass, blood soaking through his sleeve, tried to stand and was met with a rifle swinging toward him, Lena stepped between them without thinking. "He's hurt. He's not a threat. Let me bind it. Or he bleeds out." And you've got a body on your hands you didn't plan for." The young guard hesitated, looked to Victor. Victor, after a long pause, gave the smallest nod. Lena tore a strip from her apron and wrapped the waiter's arm with quick, practiced hands, the kind of competence that came from training, not instinct. Victor watched her work, watched the efficient, unhesitating way she handled blood and fear and men with guns, like all three were simply variables in a problem she'd solved before. His eyes drifted to the European pistol holstered at his own hip, the one he'd taken off a rival weeks earlier. An expensive piece he barely knew how to field strip himself. Lena's gaze had caught on it for half a second when he'd first grabbed her. Not fear, recognition. The look of someone who knew exactly what it was, what it cost, where it came from. Normal maids didn't know guns like that on sight. Victor stared at her now, blood still drying on her hands, the ballroom's chaos swirling uselessly around the strange, still center she had somehow become. "What kind of maid are you?" he asked. Quieter this time, not a demand. A genuine question, and somewhere beneath it, the first real flicker of fear. 12 miles from Blackwood Estate, in a house with no name on the gate and no address in any public record, Alessandro Romano was reviewing shipping manifests when the first call came in. He didn't answer it himself. He never did. A man in his position let calls pass through 3 layers before they reached him, each layer a filter against noise, against panic, against anything that didn't deserve his attention. This call didn't stop at any of them. His head of security, a broad, silent man named Dario who had been with the family for 11 years, walked into the study without knocking, something he had done exactly twice before, both times when someone had died. "There's an incident at Blackwood Estate," Dario said. "Gala, armed men, hostages." Alessandro didn't look up from the manifest in front of him. Blackwood was a society address, the kind of place where rich people performed generosity for cameras. It had nothing to do with him. "Why does that concern me?" "Because your wife works there." The room went very quiet. Alessandro set the manifest down with the unhurried precision of a man who had trained himself over 20 years never to let his hands move faster than his thoughts. He stood. "Show me." The footage came up on the wall screen 90 seconds later. Grainy security feed pulled from a private camera Romano Intelligence had quietly embedded in Blackwood's network the day Lena started working there. A precaution Alessandro had never told her about and prayed she would never need. He watched a man drag a pregnant maid across the ballroom floor, a pistol pressed to her cheek. He watched her go still instead of screaming. His analyst, a young woman named Priya, who had built her career reading body language off compromised footage, leaned closer to the screen, working frame by frame, enhancing the resolution around the hostage's face. Her hands, her stance. "Sir, she's not behaving like a hostage. Look at her eye movement. She's tracking the rune. That's not panic, that's..." She stopped. She'd zoomed further, isolating the woman's left wrist where her sleeve had ridden up during the struggle. A thin gold band, catching the ballroom light for less than a second before the maid tucked her arm back against her body. Priya enhanced it twice more, confirmed it 3 times in her head before she let herself say it out loud. "That's Mrs. Romano." The room didn't move. Dario's jaw tightened. The 2 junior analysts near the back wall went very still, the particular stillness of men who understood, suddenly, that the next 60 seconds would determine the rest of their careers, or their lives. Alessandro looked at the screen, at the frozen frame of his wife's wrist, the ring he'd placed there himself 2 years ago, in a chapel with no guests and no photographs, hidden now beneath her uniform sleeve in a house full of strangers who had no idea what they were looking at. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hand against the desk, did not curse, did not do any of the things Dario had braced himself for. He simply stood there, in absolute silence, for 4 full seconds. Then he said, quietly, "Bring my wife home." It was not a command that needed repeating. Dario was already moving before Alessandro finished the sentence, phone in hand, dialing a number that connected to a man who oversaw 11 others, each of whom oversaw cells of their own. A structure built over decades for exactly this kind of moment and never once used at this scale. Within 4 minutes, 6 convoys were rolling, Within 11, 2 private helicopters had lifted off from an airstrip registered to a Shell Logistics Company, flight plans already scrubbed from public record by a contact inside air traffic control who had been paid quietly for exactly this kind of emergency for the past 6 years. Within 20, 3 safe houses near Blackwood had been activated, staffed, stocked with medical equipment that exceeded what most hospitals carried. A police captain in the district received a call he had been dreading and expecting in equal measure since the day. Years earlier, he'd accepted his first envelope from a man who never gave his name. He made 2 calls of his own, one delaying a tactical response unit's deployment by claiming a jurisdictional conflict, another quietly rerouting a patrol car that had been 3 minutes from Blackwood's gates. By the time the police negotiator assigned to the hostage situation finished setting up his command post outside the estate, the perimeter had already been infiltrated by men who did not exist on any payroll, did not carry badges, and answered to no one but a voice on an encrypted line that simply said, "Confirm visual on Mrs. Romano. Do not engage. Wait for him." Inside the ballroom, Victor Kane had no idea any of this was happening. He was still pacing the marble floor, phone pressed to his ear, negotiating terms with the Blackwood family lawyer, who kept stalling, kept asking for more time, kept saying the family needed to consult their security team before authorizing any transfer of funds. Victor didn't know there was no security team left to consult. He didn't know the actual owners of Blackwood Estate had already fled through a service tunnel 20 minutes earlier, abandoning the gala, the guests, and the staff to whatever came next. He didn't know that somewhere above him, 2 helicopters were holding position in the dark, engines silent, waiting. He believed he was negotiating for ransom money. In reality, the moment prior had whispered 4 words in a room 12 miles away. Victor Kane had already signed something far more permanent than a ransom note. At the estate's main gate, the wrought iron groaned as the first vehicle arrived. Not police, not ambulance, but a convoy of black armored SUVs that rolled to a silent stop in perfect formation, headlights off. Doors opening before the wheels had fully stilled. Within minutes, 2 dozen more followed. Blackwood Estate, the untouchable address, the place rich people went to feel safe, was surrounded. Victor's phone call ended with the lawyer promising an answer within the hour. He pocketed it, rolling his shoulders against a tension that had been building since the moment he'd noticed the black SUVs gathering beyond the gates, a detail he'd dismissed as police overreaction, nothing more. He turned back to find Lena kneeling beside the elderly woman in emerald again, speaking too low for him to hear. "What are you telling her?" he asked, crossing the floor. "That her son is waiting outside and panicking, and that the fastest way to see him again is to stay calm." Lena rose, smoothing her apron, meeting Victor's eyes without flinching. "She has a heart condition. The stress alone could kill her before you ever fire a shot. Let her go." Victor laughed, short and humorless. "I'm not running a charity." "You're running a negotiation," Lena said. "Dead hostages don't negotiate. They just get you a murder charge." It was the kind of logic that should have come from a hostage negotiator, not a maid. Victor felt that thought catch again. The same itch he hadn't been able to scratch since the ballroom doors first opened. He looked at the woman in emerald, pale, trembling, genuinely fragile in a way that wasn't performance. Then at Reyes, hovering nearby with his rifle still raised, sweat soaking through his collar. "One," Victor said. "The old woman. That's it." It wasn't it. 20 minutes later, Lena was negotiating for the crying child, and his mother framing it, not as mercy, but as strategy. Fewer bodies meant fewer variables. Fewer variables meant Victor could actually control the room, instead of reacting to it. 20 minutes after that, she talked him into releasing the injured waiter, the wound on his arm having darkened past what a torn strip of apron could manage. Each time, Victor found himself agreeing before he'd fully decided to. "You could have gone with any of them," he said after the waiter was walked to the side door and handed off into the dark beyond which Victor assumed police negotiators waited, never imagining the men receiving each freed hostage wore no uniforms and answered to no department. "Every release, you create the chance. You hang back near the door. You slip out in the chaos. Why are you still standing here?" Lena looked at the remaining hostages, 30-some guests still huddled near the center of the ballroom, exhausted, frightened, watching her now with something between confusion and reverence. "Because they're still inside," she said simply. Victor didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure one existed. The collapse happened 14 minutes later. An elderly man near the back wall, Harold Whitfield, a name Lena recognized from 100 overheard conversations about shipping conglomerates and board seats, pressed a hand to his chest, swayed, and went down hard against the marble, his head narrowly missing the edge of an overturned table. The room erupted. Guests screamed. Reyes spun his rifle toward the sound on instinct, finger twitching against the guard. Victor's other men froze, unsure whether this was a trick, an opening, a threat. Lena moved before any of them could decide. She was on her knees beside Whitfield in seconds, 2 fingers pressed to his throat, her ear lowering toward his mouth, counting something only she could hear. "Heart attack," she said, voice cutting clean through the panic. "He needs aspirin. He needs his airway clear, and he needs his legs elevated. Now." "Nobody move," Victor barked, gun swinging up, not at Lena, but at the room, a reflex against chaos he couldn't yet name. "He'll die in 4 minutes if nobody moves." Lena snapped back, not even looking up at him. "Banquet table. Linens. Now." Something in her voice, flat, certain, utterly without fear, made Victor do something he would spend the rest of the night trying to understand. He nodded at Reyes. "Get her what she needs." What followed was unlike anything Victor had witnessed in 15 years of crime. Lena tore linens into makeshift bindings, propped Whitfield's legs against an overturned chair, dug through a fallen guest's handbag for the aspirin she somehow knew the woman carried, and crushed it between 2 spoons when Whitfield couldn't swallow it whole. She counted compressions under her breath when his pulse faltered, steady and exact, her hands never once shaking despite the gun that remained, throughout all of it, somewhere near her own back. 4 minutes later, Whitfield's eyes fluttered open, his breathing steadied. Color crept back into a face that had gone the color of ash. The ballroom exhaled as one organism. Victor stood several feet back, gun lowered without realizing he'd lowered it, watching the maid who'd just saved a man's life with banquet linens and crushed aspirin while a kidnapping unraveled around her. He'd seen field medics with less composure. He'd seen men who'd survived combat lose their nerve faster than this woman, who claimed to do nothing more than dust furniture and pour coffee. For the first time since he'd grabbed her in the chaos of the opening minutes, Victor didn't see leverage kneeling on that marble floor. He saw a person, one he understood less with every passing minute, and feared, though he wouldn't have admitted it yet, slightly more. Lena rose slowly, Whitfield's blood drying on her hands, and met Victor's stare without apology, without explanation. The same unreadable calm she'd worn since the moment he'd first pressed a gun to her cheek. Victor opened his mouth, closed it, then finally asked the question that had been building in him since the ballroom windows first shattered. "Who taught you all this?" A maid who had every chance to save herself, and instead kept risking her own safety for strangers. If Lena's courage is hitting you right now, smash that like button. And if you believe real strength doesn't come from a gun but from the heart, drop Empire in the comments. The biggest twist is still coming. Lena didn't answer Victor's question. She never got the chance to. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a number he didn't recognize. The kind of call he would normally have ignored in the middle of a job. Something made him answer it anyway. Maybe instinct, maybe the same unease that had been building in him for the last hour, looking for somewhere to land. "Yeah." The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Castellano, an informant Victor had used twice before for low-level intelligence. Addresses, schedules, nothing that ever mattered much. This time, Castellano's voice was different. Tight, fast, scared. "Victor, where are you right now? Tell me you're not at Blackwood. What's it to you? There's black SUVs all over the news feeds, unmarked, surrounding the estate. Nobody's releasing a statement. No press, no official anything. You know what that means. Means somebody's got money and wants it quiet. It means somebody's got power and wants it handled." Castellano's breathing had gone ragged. "I got a name an hour ago. Pure luck. Wasn't even looking for it. Somebody flagged a Maid's photo through a private network, asking for confirmation. You know who flagged it?" Victor's grip on the phone tightened. "Who?" A pause, long enough that Victor heard his own pulse. "Romano. Alessandro Romano. The name landed in Victor's chest like a dropped weight. "That maid you grabbed," Castellano said, voice dropping lower, like even saying it out loud might summon something. "She's not a maid, Victor. She's Romano's wife." Victor said nothing. The ballroom around him kept moving. Hostages murmuring, Reyes shifting his weight near the door. But for a moment, Victor heard none of it. The noise replaced by a high, thin ringing that had nothing to do with the room. He turned, slowly, and looked at Lena. She was watching him. She already knew, he realized. She'd known since the first time she'd looked into his eyes and told him he'd already lost. "Boss?" Reyes had drifted closer, sensing the shift in the air before he understood it. "What's wrong?" Victor lowered the phone without ending the call. Castellano's voice still tinny and panicked on the other end. "She's Romano's wife." The words moved through the room like a current. One of his men, a younger one named Diaz who'd barely spoken since the gala began, went white, backing toward the wall as if distance alone could undo what he'd already done. "We need to run. Now. We need to run right now." "Shut up!" Victor snapped, though his own hands had gone unsteady. The older man, Marsh, stepped forward instead, his face hardening into something colder. "Or we finish this the only way it ends clean. No witness, no wife, no problem." His eyes cut to Lena. "Romano doesn't negotiate. You know that. He buries everyone in the room and salts the ground after. Our only shot is making sure there's nothing left to bury us for." Two of the men actually raised their weapons toward Lena before Victor stepped between them, arm out, his own gun suddenly feeling heavier in his hand than it had all night. "Nobody touches her," he said, and didn't fully understand why he meant it until the words were already out. "You're going to get us killed over a sense of honor now?" Marsh demanded. "I said nobody touches her." Victor's voice didn't rise, but something in it ended the argument anyway. The room settled into an uneasy, fractured silence, his men watching him now with the same confusion they'd been watching Lena with for the last hour. Lichter turned back to her, lowering his voice, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "Why would the wife of Alessandro Romano clean floors for 2 years? You could have had anything. Bodyguards, mansions of your own. Instead, you're scrubbing coffee stains and getting held at gunpoint by men who don't even register on your husband's level." Lena's hand drifted, almost without thought, to her stomach. "Because power makes enemies," she said quietly. "Every house Alessandro owns, every name people whisper when they say Romano, all of it is a target. I spent 4 years before this watching people use me to get to him, watching men just like you, just like Marsh, calculate what I was worth as leverage instead of as a person." She met his eyes. "I didn't want that for my child. I wanted 2 years where the only thing she'd ever hear was birdsong instead of gunfire, where nobody would ever look at her and see a price tag." Victor said nothing for a long moment. He thought unbidden of his own daughter. 11 years old, living 3 states away with a mother who'd stopped answering his calls 2 years ago, after the debts, after the first arrest, after Victor had become the kind of man whose name she'd eventually be embarrassed to share. He thought of all the nights he'd told himself this life was temporary. One more job, one more score, always one more. He looked at the woman standing in front of him, calm, steady, more afraid for the people in this ballroom than for her own life, and felt something crack open in his chest that he didn't have a name for. "You really thought you could hide forever," he said, but it came out softer than he meant it to. "I knew I couldn't," Lena said. "I just wanted to give her as much peace as I could before it ended." Outside, beyond the shattered ballroom windows, headlights swept the long gravel drive. A car door opened. Then another. Dozens more, in near-perfect silence, doors closing like a held breath being released. Reyes turned toward the sound first, his face going slack with the particular terror of a man finally understanding exactly how badly he had miscalculated. "Victor," he whispered. "He's here." The ballroom's massive doors swung open without a sound, as if the building itself had been waiting for this moment and knew better than to announce it. Alessandro Romano stepped through first. He wore a light gray suit, immaculate despite the hour, cut close enough to reveal the discipline of a man who treated his own body like another weapon in his arsenal. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm, and the ink there, old, intricate, the kind of tattoos that told a story only a handful of people alive could read, caught the chandelier light as he moved, His expression carried no rage that anyone could name, just stillness. The kind of stillness that made grown men in his employ choose their words with extraordinary care. Behind him, a wall of soldiers filled the doorway and kept filling it more than the ballroom could comfortably hold, all of them silent, all of them watching Victor's 5 remaining men, the way men watch something they've already decided is finished. Nobody in that ballroom spoke. Even the guests, exhausted and traumatized past the point of new fear, seemed to understand instinctively that this required absolute silence. Alessandra's eyes moved once across the room. Marsh, Diaz, Reyes, the overturned tables, the broken glass still glittering across the marble, and then found Lena, and did not move again. He didn't look at Victor. He didn't look at the gun in Victor's hand. For several long seconds, the most dangerous man in that ballroom seemed to see only his wife. Lena. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet enough that it shouldn't have carried, and yet it filled the entire room. "I'm all right," she said. "We're all right." Something in his jaw tightened at "we," a flicker of the fury he was otherwise containing with an effort that visibly cost him. Victor's arm closed tighter around Lena's shoulders, his gun lifting back to her temple. Not a decision so much as a reflex, the last instinct of a cornered animal. "Don't come any closer." Alessandra stopped exactly where he stood. He raised one hand, slow, open, not a surrender, but a command to his own men. He went rigid and motionless behind him without needing to be told twice. "You're Victor Kane," Alessandra said. It wasn't a question. $41,000 in debt to the Callaway Syndicate. A daughter you haven't seen in 2 years. A mother in a care facility you can't afford. His eyes didn't leave Victor's face. "I know more about you than your own crew does." Victor's throat worked. "Then you know I don't have anything left to lose." "I know you released 6 hostages tonight when you didn't have to," Alessandra said. "I know you let my wife treat a dying man instead of using the chaos to disappear. I know that 20 minutes ago you stopped one of your own men from putting a bullet in her." His voice didn't rise, didn't soften. It simply continued, level and absolute. "That tells me you're not the kind of man who wants to die in this room tonight." "And if I let her go," Victor said, voice cracking slightly, "what happens to me? That depends entirely on what you do in the next 30 seconds. Marsh, beside Victor, raised his own rifle toward the soldiers crowding the doorway. "We're not walking out of here either way. Might as well make it count." He didn't finish the sentence. 2 red dots appeared on his chest before he could. Steady, unmoving, and he froze completely, the rifle suddenly feeling much heavier in his hands. The room held its breath. Lena felt Victor's grip tremble against her shoulder, not from violence now, but from a man standing at the edge of a decision he didn't know how to make. She spoke before anyone else could. "Alessandro." Her voice was calm, steady, the same voice that had talked Victor into releasing 6 hostages, the same voice that had stopped a panicked guard from shooting a frightened waiter. "Look at me." He did. Instantly. Completely. "Our child," she said, "deserves a father who wins without starting another war." The words landed in the room like something physical. Alessandra's hands, which had curled into fists at his sides without his noticing, slowly opened. He let people go. Lena continued, never breaking eye contact with her husband, never once acknowledging the gun still pressed near her face. "He saved my life by not killing me the moment he realized who I was." He could have. His men wanted to. He didn't let them. Alessandra's gaze finally shifted to Victor, not with mercy, not yet, but with something that hadn't been there a moment ago. Consideration. "You have one offer," Alessandro said. "It will not be repeated. Lower the weapon, walk out of this room alive, and into custody instead of a grave. Your debts, your mother's care, your daughter, all of it becomes my concern, handled quietly, the way you handled my wife tonight. Refuse, and nothing in this world will find what's left of you." Victor's arm, still locked around Lena's shoulders, began to shake. He thought of his daughter's face, the last photograph he had of her, 11 years old and smiling at a birthday party he hadn't been invited to. He thought of every choice that had led him into this ballroom, every door he'd closed behind himself until this was the only one left. He thought of Lena kneeling over Harold Whitfield with crushed aspirin and torn linens, saving a stranger's life while a gun was pointed at her own head. She had shown him mercy when she owed him none. Slowly, so slowly that the whole room seemed to hold its breath through every inch of it. Victor's grip loosened. The pistol slipped from his fingers. It struck the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot, though no one had fired. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. For the first time since the chandeliers had shattered hours earlier, the room was utterly, completely still. The pistol's echo had barely faded before Alessandra's men moved, fast and disciplined, disarming Victor's remaining crew before any of them found the nerve to reconsider. Marsh dropped his rifle the instant the red dots reappeared on his chest. Diaz was already on his knees, hands laced behind his head, sobbing with something that looked almost like relief. Reyes simply stood frozen until one of Alessandra's soldiers gently took the weapon from his slack fingers. Outside, the police negotiator who had spent the last 2 hours trying to establish contact with kidnappers who never answered finally got his opening, though he would never fully understand why the gunmen surrendered so completely so suddenly, or why the black SUVs that had surrounded the perimeter were already gone by the time his unit moved in. Officers flooded the ballroom within minutes. Paramedics followed, working through the crowd of traumatized guests, checking pulses, treating the last of the minor injuries. Harold Whitfield, sitting upright now with color back in his face, gripped a paramedic's sleeve and insisted repeatedly that the maid had saved his life and someone needed to write that down. Reporters arrived not long after, cameras flashing against the broken chandeliers, voices overlapping as they tried to piece together a story that kept refusing to make sense. A foiled kidnapping, no shots fired, the perpetrators surrendering without explanation. And at the center of it all, whispers about a maid the wealthiest family in the state had employed for 2 years without ever truly seeing. The Blackwood family, returning under police escort to find their estate full of officers instead of guests, listened to the early reports with visible confusion. Their household maid, quiet, unassuming Lena Brooks, who'd never once asked for a raise or a day off, was being called something else entirely by the strangers now combing through their ballroom. Mrs. Romano. It took the Blackwood matriarch nearly a full minute to connect the name to the man now standing protectively beside her former employee, his hand resting against the small of her back, as though he could not bear to put any distance between them. Around the ballroom, guests who had spent 2 years walking past Lena without a second glance began remembering her now in fragments that suddenly meant something different. The extra blanket she'd quietly brought for a shivering child during a winter gala. The way she always remembered which guests took their coffee black and which needed 2 sugars without ever being told twice. The night she'd stayed an extra hour, unasked, to sit with an elderly guest who'd had no one to drive her home. None of it had been performance. It had simply been who she was, even when no one was watching, even when she had every reason in the world to disappear into herself instead. Alessandro knelt beside her on the marble floor, ignoring the officers, the cameras, the chaos still moving around them. For the first time since he'd walked through those doors, his hand wasn't curled into a fist or resting on a weapon. It moved gently, almost reverently, to the curve of her stomach. "Are you both all right?" he asked, voice low, meant only for her. Lena covered his hand with her own and smiled. Not the practiced, careful smile she'd worn for 2 years of service, but something unguarded. Something that hadn't existed in this house until now. "We're all right," she said. "We're finally all right." For the first time in 2 years, she didn't have to lower her voice, didn't have to check who was listening, didn't have to be anyone other than exactly who she was. Victor was led out in handcuffs sometime later, flanked by 2 officers who had no idea the quiet conversation that had happened minutes earlier in a hallway just out of camera range. Alessandra's voice low and final. "My word doesn't break. Your debts are gone. Your mother's care is handled. When you're out, there's an honest job waiting, if you want it." Victor hadn't said anything in response. He hadn't needed to. The look on his face, equal parts disbelief and something close to hope, said enough. He went into custody without resistance, the first peaceful surrender of his life, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the wreckage of everything he'd built toward this night, something in him had genuinely begun to change. Weeks later, Blackwood Estate hosted another gathering. The ballroom had been restored, New glass in the windows, new crystal in the chandeliers, though everyone who walked through its doors that evening understood in some unspoken way that nothing about the place would ever feel quite the same again. Lena arrived not through the service entrance but through the grand front doors, her hand resting in Alessandra's, her belly rounder now beneath a dress no one would ever mistake for a uniform. The staff she had worked beside for 2 years gathered near the foyer, and one by one they came forward, not with the careful distance owed to a stranger of wealth and power, but with the unguarded warmth owed to someone they had genuinely loved long before they knew what to call her. One former co-worker, an older woman who trained Lena on her very first week, embraced her with tears in her eyes and whispered, "You were never above us because of power. You were extraordinary because you chose kindness when you never had to." Lena rested a hand against her growing belly, looking around the room at the life she had so nearly lost. The chandeliers, the staff, the strangers who had become something like family without either side ever realizing it. The woman everyone had overlooked for 2 years had finally stepped into the light, not as the feared Mafia Boss's wife, not as a name whispered in fear or admiration, as a mother who had proven, in the space of one impossible night, that compassion could end a war more powerfully than violence ever could. The quietest woman in the ballroom had never needed protection. She had carried the strongest heart in the room and the future of an empire. If this story moved you, if you believe real love protects and real power lies in compassion, share this with someone who needs a story like this today. Subscribe so you never miss the next emotional thriller. And tell me in the comments, if you were in Alessandra's position, would you have shown Victor the same mercy? I want to hear your answer below.